$4,000. That's how much advanced cold weather gear the average American Marine arrived with in northern Norway. Layered insulation, heated liners, high-tech fabrics designed to keep a human body functional in some of the harshest conditions on Earth. The British Royal Marines arrived with jackets that looked like they belonged in a museum. Same exercise, same terrain, same weather. 3 weeks later, one battalion reported double-digit cold weather injuries. The other reported none, not fewer. Not acceptable losses, none. Exercise controllers assumed there had been a mistake, cheating, different rules, different conditions. There weren't. The British didn't have better equipment. They didn't get better weather. They didn't get special treatment. They had something far more uncomfortable. A doctrine designed for the worst possible day, not the best one. And in the Arctic, that difference decides who keeps moving and who freezes in place. The Arctic is no longer a training curiosity. It's not an exotic environment reserved for specialists or survival courses. It's becoming a central operating space, one where logistics are fragile, communications are unreliable, and mistakes compound quickly. NATO knows this. That's why exercises like cold response exist. Why thousands of troops rotate through northern Norway every year. Why billions are spent on cold weather equipment, infrastructure, and specialized training packages. On paper, NATO should dominate here. Modern forces, global supply chains, unmatched technological depth, and yet the same problems appear exercise after exercise. Units slow down, timelines slip, cold injuries accumulate, decision-making degrades, not because soldiers are weak, not because they lack discipline, and not because they aren't trained, but because the environment punishes certain assumptions and rewards others. The Arctic doesn't care how advanced your equipment is. It doesn't care how well your systems work in theory. It only reveals what your doctrine quietly assumes will always be available: reliability, comfort, predictability. This isn't a story about one nation doing everything right. It's a case study in how small, invisible differences in philosophy scale into decisive advantages over time. Because in the cold, failure rarely arrives all at once. It arrives slowly, silently, one compromised decision at a time. And by the time you notice it, you're already behind the weather. Exercise cold response takes place above the Arctic Circle in northern Norway. This isn't a controlled environment. There are no heated classrooms waiting at the end of the day. No guarantees that conditions will stay within planning limits. Temperatures swing without warning. Wind cuts through valleys and along ridge. Snow doesn't fall gently. It accumulates, drifts, hardens, and collapses underfoot. Movement is slow. Visibility is unreliable. Every mistake costs time and energy. The exercise runs for weeks, not days. Long enough for fatigue to matter. Long enough for small decisions to compound into systemic problems. Multiple NATO nations take part. Infantry, Marines, airborne units, each arriving with their own doctrine, assumptions, and training culture. On the surface, everything looks standardized. Common objectives, shared planning factors, interoperable equipment. But the Arctic has a way of stripping away surface-level similarities. What remains is how units manage heat, movement, command, and discomfort over time. Not in a single dramatic moment, but across thousands of small, repetitive actions. Cold response isn't designed to test survival. It's designed to test whether a force can remain combat effective when the environment quietly works against every system it relies on. And it's here, not in the first hours, but over the following days, that the differences begin to appear. The first differences don't show up in performance reports. They show up in behavior. As patrols begin moving through the terrain, one pattern becomes obvious. NATO units manage temperature constantly. They stop to add layers, start moving and overheat, stop again to remove layers, slow down to vent heat, speed up to warm hands and feet. Each adjustment is logical. Each one is taught. Each one feels like good discipline, but none of them are free. Every temperature change demands a decision. Every decision interrupts momentum. Every interruption adds friction. British patrols do something that looks wrong at first. They don't adjust. They step off wearing a single configuration and keep it on all day. They overheat, they sweat, they stay uncomfortable, and then they keep moving. No pauses to fine-tune layers. No constant micro-corrections. No debates over whether it's time to stop again. Discomfort isn't treated as a problem to solve. It's treated as the baseline condition. And that single choice quietly removes dozens of decisions from every patrol. Decisions that would otherwise compete with navigation, security, spacing, and timing. Early on, this difference seems insignificant. By the end of the first few days, it isn't. Cold weather doesn't just attack the body. It attacks attention. Every environment imposes a tax on decision-making, but the Arctic is relentless. It drains focus through discomfort, fatigue, and constant low-level stress. Now add temperature management on top of that. Every time a patrol halts to adjust layers, someone has to decide, is it cold enough to stop? Is it warm enough to remove gear? Will we overheat in the next ascent? How long will this take? None of these decisions are complex on their own, but together, repeated dozens of times a day, they consume mental bandwidth. This is cognitive load, the accumulation of small necessary choices that quietly degrade situational awareness. British doctrine removes that entire category of decision. By accepting discomfort as normal, they eliminate the need to constantly reassess temperature. There is no debate. There is no optimization loop. The patrol's mental energy stays focused on terrain, spacing, enemy simulation, and time. The cold is no longer something to manage. It becomes background noise. And in an environment where mistakes rarely announce themselves immediately, that difference matters more than it seems. Because the units that arrive mentally fresher at the end of each day aren't the ones who were most comfortable. They read the ones who made the fewest decisions that didn't directly move the mission forward. As the exercise continues, the differences stop being subtle. By the third day, fatigue has set in. Small inefficiencies begin to show, and the way each force relates to its equipment starts to matter. Modern NATO cold weather doctrine is built around reliability, heated shelters at night, hot meals on schedule, dry sleeping systems, predictable resupply. When all of those systems function, performance is high, morale stays up, recovery is faster. But this creates an unspoken assumption that comfort will arrive on time. When supply delays occur, and in the Arctic, they always do, the impact is immediate. Shelters arrive late. Fuel runs short. Hot food is delayed or missed entirely. Effectiveness drops, not because soldiers can't endure hardship, but because the baseline expectation has shifted. The British approach is deliberately different. From the beginning, their operating baseline is minimum comfort. Shelter is basic. Food is functional. Warmth is earned through movement, not provided by systems. When supply delays occur, nothing changes. There is no psychological shock, no sudden loss of capability, because nothing essential was assumed in the first place. This isn't about toughness. It's about dependency. For one force, comfort is a requirement that must be maintained. For the other, comfort is a bonus that may or may not appear. And in the Arctic, only one of those assumptions survives contact with reality. The difference becomes impossible to ignore during the movement phase. Midway through the exercise, units are tasked with a timed movement, 15 kilometers, mountainous terrain, full combat load. This isn't a race, it's a planning test. NATO planning factors allocate 10 hours for the movement. That accounts for terrain, weather, weight, and rest cycles. The results look solid on paper. American Marines complete the route in 9 hours. German paratroopers finish in 8, both well within expectations. Then the British Royal Marines report in 5.5 hours. Exercise controllers assume there's been an error, a navigation shortcut, an unreported vehicle movement, something missed. There wasn't. The British didn't move faster by sprinting. They didn't travel lighter. They didn't skip safety procedures. They simply didn't stop. No scheduled rest breaks. No long halts to manage heat. No repeated cycles of starting and stopping. They moved continuously at a sustainable pace from start to finish. In cold weather, tempo isn't just about speed. It's about survival. Because every halt allows heat to bleed away. Sweat cools, circulation slows, extremities lose warmth. Stopping feels safe. In the Arctic, it's often the most dangerous thing you can do. The British doctrine recognizes this. Movement is warmth, tempo is protection. And once you understand that, everything else begins to make sense. To understand why continuous movement matters, you have to look at what actually happens to the body in extreme cold. While moving, the body generates heat. Blood circulation stays high. Muscles remain active. Moisture from sweat evaporates gradually. The system is stable, even if it's uncomfortable. The moment a unit stops, that stability disappears. Sweat trapped in clothing begins to cool. Airflow increases heat loss. Circulation slows, especially to hands and feet. Within minutes, the body starts prioritizing core temperature. Extremities are sacrificed first. This is where most cold injuries occur. Not during hard movement, not during exertion, but during halts. Rest breaks were intended to prevent fatigue. In the Arctic, they often do the opposite. They create cycles of overheating followed by rapid cooling. Each cycle increases risk. British doctrine avoids this trap by reducing stops to the absolute minimum. Not because rest isn't valuable, but because in cold environments, poorly timed rest is dangerous. By maintaining steady movement, the body stays warm enough to function. Circulation stays active. Cold never gets the opportunity to take hold. It's counterintuitive, but the data supports it. British cold injury rates during the exercise were near zero. The NATO average was several times higher. The difference wasn't toughness, it was timing. And timing, in the cold, decides whether you stay operational or become a casualty. Continuous movement sounds simple. In practice, it's one of the hardest things to sustain. You can't improvise it during an exercise. You can't order it into existence halfway through a march. And you can't rely on motivation to carry it over long distances. It has to be trained and filtered long before anyone reaches the Arctic. British Royal Marine training is built around this requirement. From the earliest stages, candidates are exposed to long-distance load carriage, not as occasional events, but as defining standards, yumps of 30 miles, then longer, often without rest stops, not fast, not dramatic, just relentless. The purpose isn't endurance for its own sake. It's teaching the body and mind to function without relying on pauses for recovery. If a candidate can't maintain steady movement under load, they don't adapt, they leave. This creates a force where continuous movement isn't a special capability, it's the default. By the time British Marines arrive in Norway, the Arctic doesn't introduce a new demand. It simply amplifies one they already understand. Other NATO forces train movement differently. Marches are broken into segments. Rest cycles are planned. Recovery is structured. Those methods work in many environments. In the Arctic, they introduce risk. Because when doctrine expects rest, but the environment punishes it, only one side adapts fast enough. An adaptation, in the cold, has to happen before the exercise begins. As the exercise progresses, the environment begins attacking something else. Communications. Cold drains batteries. Terrain blocks signals. Weather interferes with transmission. For most modern forces, this creates hesitation. Units slow down. Patrols wait for clarification. Movement pauses while leaders attempt to re-establish contact. Timelines slip, not because orders are unclear, but because guidance is assumed to be continuous. The British response is different. When communications degrade, they don't stop. Every patrol leader already understands the objective, the intent, the time window, and the role their element plays in the larger plan. If radios fail, execution continues. Not because discipline is stricter, but because authority has already been delegated. British doctrine places heavy emphasis on mission command. Orders describe outcomes, not methods. The how is left deliberately flexible. So when the environment removes the ability to ask for permission, nothing essential is lost. Other units, trained to expect constant synchronization, hesitate. They wait for updates that may never come. They protect alignment at the cost of tempo. In the Arctic, waiting is rarely neutral. It increases exposure. It increases fatigue. And it gives the environment more time to erode effectiveness. British units accept that communication will fail. They plan for it from the start. Because doctrine that only works when systems function perfectly doesn't survive long in extreme conditions. And the Arctic never guarantees perfect conditions. The final week brings what no exercise planner can control. A blizzard, visibility collapses to less than 50 meters. Wind scours exposed skin. Temperatures plunge well below anything considered comfortable or forgiving. This isn't a pause condition. The scenario continues. A multinational assault is still scheduled to take place. For many units, the blizzard forces a fundamental reassessment. Movement slows, formations tighten. Decisions are delayed in search of certainty that no longer exists. The environment has removed margins. Navigation becomes harder. Communication degrades further. Every halt feels colder than the last. British units don't change their approach. They move when movement is required. They stop only when stopping is unavoidable. They accept that precision will decrease, but intent will not. Orders don't become more detailed. They become simpler. Objectives remain clear. Timelines remain intact. Methods adapt in real time. The blizzard doesn't break the plan. It strips it down to what actually matters. And in that stripped-down environment, the force that trained for discomfort, ambiguity, and failure doesn't slow down. It reveals itself, not by dramatic action, but by continuing to function when conditions say it shouldn't be possible. At this point, the question becomes obvious. If the advantages are so clear, why doesn't everyone do this? Why doesn't NATO simply adopt British cold weather doctrine and move on? Because doctrine like this isn't a checklist. It isn't a new piece of equipment. It isn't a revised field manual. And it isn't something you can bolt onto an existing force with a short course. British cold weather capability is the product of decades of exposure, continuous training rotations in Norway, institutional memory embedded at every level, from recruit training to senior leadership, 6 months in cold environments, not 2 weeks, repeated failure, not controlled success, adaptation driven by experience, not theory. Most NATO forces treat cold weather as a problem to be survived. British doctrine treats it as an environment to be exploited. That difference shapes everything. Training emphasizes effectiveness, not comfort. Movement is prioritized over optimization. Command is decentralized because it has to be. The US Marine Corps, in particular, is trying to close this gap. Arctic programs have expanded. Training time has increased. Doctrine is evolving. But the mindset shift is slower. Because accepting discomfort as normal, not temporary, runs counter to how modern forces are usually built. And the Arctic exposes that tension mercilessly. You can't shortcut cultural change. You can't simulate decades of institutional learning in a single exercise. And until that gap is closed, the cold will continue to favor the force that planned for the worst day first. At the start of the exercise, the difference looked superficial. Old jackets versus modern systems. Minimal gear versus advanced equipment. Comfort versus capability. By the end, it was clear none of that was the real story. The British didn't outperform NATO because they were tougher. They didn't succeed because they ignored risk. And they didn't win the Arctic through tradition or stubbornness. They won because their doctrine assumed failure from the start. Failure of supply, failure of communications, failure of comfort, failure of certainty. And when those failures arrived, as they always do in the Arctic, nothing fundamental broke. The cold didn't surprise them. It didn't force them to adapt mid-exercise. It simply revealed what they had already prepared for. Modern militaries often try to solve environmental problems with equipment, better insulation, smarter systems, more redundancy. Those things matter. But the Arctic doesn't reward what you carry. It rewards what you assume. British Marines assume discomfort. They assume ambiguity. They assume that movement must continue even when conditions degrade. And because of that, they don't survive the cold. They operate inside it, while others pause, adjust, and wait for conditions to improve. They keep moving, and in the Arctic, that difference is everything.